Okay, awesome. So I don't have a lot of slides, but I do have some, and we're going to go through those. Mostly it's for just logistics and boring stuff, because we've got a long day ahead of us. It's going to be fun. So yeah, you've all seen this from my anybody who came to my, well, actually I spoke to everybody yesterday. So yeah, you've all seen this slide. It's kind of fun stuff. If there's any reason to come to my slides, it's to click on the picture of my dog to see a cute. Okay, I'll show you. There she is. Isn't she adorable? She's so cute. But she's growing super fast. She was like probably 12 weeks when I took this picture. She's now just over like almost 5 months. And she's going to grow to be like 70 pounds. So she's getting really big. She's so cute. Okay, cool. So let's get things started. Sorry, did somebody have a question? No? Okay. So I think it's really important for us to get our blood flowing. So if everybody could please stand really quick. If you're physically able and willing to join us, even those of you watching at home. Okay, arms out in front of you like this. And we'll squat down. We'll do 12 air squats together. Ready? 1, 2, count out loud with me. 3, 4. It's more fun when you count. 5, 6, 7. You're doing great. 8, 9, 10. Let's start over. 1, 2. No, just kidding. That's it. That's it. All right, stretch. And over one side. Over to the other. Awesome. Okay. Why don't you turn to the person next to you, introduce yourself, and thank them for coming to the workshop. All right. Now you should actually know the people who are around you, so you can ask them questions and work together and stuff. I think that's good. Okay. So I'm so glad you're all becoming such good friends. Okay. So the workshop, it's very exercise focused. So I did this for front-end masters 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago. And we spent the whole day doing the workshop, and the recording is 3.5 hours. So because they chopped out the exercise time, right? So most of the workshop time will be spent on your computer doing exercises. And to make things even better, I won't actually teach you the exercise until after you've gone through the exercise. So the exercises are littered with comments to help you know what you're supposed to do. You have a usage example, so we're going to be making components that are flexible and stuff. You'll have an example of how that component's supposed to be used, and then the comments to help you modify the component so that it supports that API. So I will not be teaching you how to do it and then you doing it. You're going to do it first, and then we'll walk through the solution. So yeah, it's a lot of fun. So I did this pre-event survey before the front-end masters workshop. And somebody said that they wanted to learn patterns that put a smile on your face when you're implementing components with them. And that's what I hope that this thing is. It puts a smile on my face. So a couple of things. This is not, the examples or the exercises are not 100% practical. The whole thing is a toggle component. So it's a component that has one item of state. It's a Boolean, true or false. And I mean, how many of those are you going to write? Probably one, and maybe not even that. So in an effort to avoid overloading you with too much domain-specific information about examples, the example itself is really, really primitive or basic, but that's intentional so that you can focus your learning on the patterns. And the patterns that we're talking about, I've implemented and shipped to production. They're solid, really awesome. One of PayPal's most popular open source projects is Downshift, and that's where most of these patterns, where I learned most of these patterns, was in implementing Downshift. And so yeah, these things are absolutely practical. And we're not covering everything you can do. There are some patterns like component injection. There are some additional things with render props where you can return a component as part of what you call your render prop with, and various other things that you can do, and we don't have time to cover all those things, and the workshop doesn't even have exercises for those things either. Maybe one day I'll add those, but yeah, we certainly don't have time to cover everything. And there are things yet to be discovered, like when React Suspense comes out, there will be all kinds of new patterns you can do with that. It'll be cool. So here are some of the things that we cover. We're going to do compound components, render props, state initializers, state reducers, control props, provided pattern, and higher order components. The bonus, I actually removed the bonus, and I forgot to remove it from the slides. I can add it back, but I can show you, like, basically, you take the toggle component and refactor it to store Redux as the state, and so and then use that. So there's not an exercise for that, but you could totally do that to practice things, just to kind of show off that these patterns actually are useful in really big ways for bigger kinds of components. Okay, so if you haven't done the setup already, then do it now. You go to Advanced React Patterns V2 on my GitHub, and if you don't want to set up things locally on your computer, then you can just go to this Code Sandbox link, and everything runs in the browser, even the tests. You can pop open the tests and see these, and we'll be leveraging the tests a lot for you to know that you've accomplished your task, and then you can jump around and see the final version in the exercise. All of the stuff, it's all right here. So if you want to just do it in the browser, that's totally cool. Otherwise, set things up locally, and you can use your own editor and stuff. More boring stuff. So please raise your hand. This is not like a talk or anything at a conference. This is a workshop. So raise your hand if you have questions. Interrupt me. That's totally cool. Yes, are you? Maybe we could close these doors too, so that we can. Yeah, thank you. So, yeah, there is a workshop chat room. So if you don't feel comfortable raising your hand, or you don't want to interrupt me or anything, on the repo there's this link, chat on Gitter. Oh, actually I forgot to fix that. Dang it. I'll fix that later. So you can open up the chat if you want to ask questions on there. So for each of the exercises, there's a test at the bottom of the test file for that exercise that has a link for the feedback form. It's actually not just a feedback form, it's an elaboration form. And it's scientifically proven that if you elaborate what you have learned, then you'll remember it better. And so this is part of the teaching experience, part of the learning experience for you. If you have questions for me, like I mentioned something offhand, which I often actually do that, and I probably shouldn't as much, but if I just mention something and you want to know more about it, you can ask on my AMA, and it's on GitHub. And then I tweet about stuff a lot, so if you like to read about stuff, you can follow me on Twitter. Okay, so here's the routine. I'm gonna give you a basic intro to the exercise, like here's what the usage is and what you're supposed to build, and then you'll work through the exercise. If you want to pair program, you'll learn more, so that's up to you. But yeah, working together on these exercises is totally cool, and you'll learn more doing that. Then fill out the feedback form. Some of the exercises have a bonus, and that's indicated. Oh, whoops! By what is going on? Go away. That's indicated by the 100 emoji symbol, so you'll see that around. And then help other people and make pull requests if you see anything. So if you finish early, you can do all this other stuff, so you shouldn't be bored, hopefully. Okay, any questions about logistics of how this workshop's going to run? I think we do have like some breaks built in to the timing, and I'm not sure exactly when those are, so throw something at me when it's time to have a break. Just kidding, I'll try to keep up with that. But okay, cool. Let's get it going. So just a really quick intro to the ideas around, or where I learned these patterns. So this is a PayPal project. I built it for P2P. and it's called Downshift. It is, here we can pop open the storybook actually. It's an autocomplete experience that has like a ton of flexibility and capabilities. So on P2P we had the country selector that we needed to have for people to select the country they want to send money to. And then we also had a users, like your contacts chooser, which was actually wildly different from the country selector in terms of the way that it looked and how it behaved even in some ways. And so we had like 3 or 4, and we had some others as well. So we had like 3 implementations of autocomplete in the app, and it was like I was getting sick and tired of maintaining all of these. And so I decided, okay, I'm going to make one more, and this is going to be the last one to rule them all, and we'll encapsulate all of the use cases in this one component. And I spent like, I think it was like 2 weeks, and you can actually watch me. I live streamed building this thing. It was like 3 days of live streaming, building Downshift. And I went through the compound components for the start, and we'll learn about that. And then I decided to go with render props. And then it doesn't actually use the provider pattern, but or higher order components, but I've implemented those things on top of the existing Downshift API. So lots and lots of these different patterns that we're going to be learning, I learned from building Downshift. And it's pretty cool. It's like PayPal's second most popular JavaScript open source project. So yeah.
Why Downshift? Oh.
Why what? Oh, why the name Downshift? That was actually suggested by Kai. I don't know what his last name is. Holland, I think. I don't remember his last name. But he built Emotion, and he's a cool person. He helped me out with Glamorous as well. But anyway, he just has like this list of names for projects that he'll use eventually, and he just grabbed one and was like, hey, you could use this one. It actually, I started calling it React Autocompletely. It's like, it's completely, like it's the complete autocomplete. Yeah, it was kind of silly. I didn't like it a whole lot. So then I switched it to React Kadabra, like the Pokemon, Abracadabra. Then I decided that might be like, yeah, and the emoji was like the crystal ball. I thought that was kind of cool, but then I decided that both of those actually pigeonholed Downshift into like just for autocompletes. But Downshift can be used to build any kind of experience where you have a menu that opens based off of user interaction, and you can select items, so like drop downs as well. And so that's where I landed with Downshift, and I like the little race car. I think that's cool. So, okay, that's it for slides. My last slide is seriously a thank you. So we're all done with slides. So you can pop open the Code Sandbox, or you can open it up locally. How many people have it all set up on their machine ready to go? Okay, most of you? Good. If you don't, and if you're struggling with that, I'll help you during the exercise, or you can just pop open the Code Sandbox. Should be good. I actually forgot to pop it open on my machine, so let me do that really quick. I just started using Visual Studio Code. It looks like I got an update. I used to not like it, but now it has a good Vim mode, so I'm happy with it. Okay, so let me give you a quick intro to the project. So you're going to have a source directory. This is actually a pretty standard Create React app application for the most part. It's using like an alpha version of Create React app or of React scripts because I want version 2. But other than that, it's pretty much all normal. In the source directory, you have exercises and exercises final, and that's where your code that you're going to work on is in exercises. And we'll just look at exercise 1 really quick. Then I got a couple other things to show you. So I'd like to introduce you to Cody the Koala. He is here to help you know what you're supposed to do. So there are some comments that are just like me talking to you about like stuff that's going on. But then you got the koala bear anywhere you need to actually do something, and Cody will tell you what to do. And then you also have Marty the money bag, and he will give you spoilers and things that like copy paste code, or like if you're really struggling, then here's the tip. And then there's I haven't given this emoji a name, but it's the 100 symbol emoji. Maybe I should come up with a different one that has a fun name. But that's extra credit. So if you want to do something extra that I may or may not have tests for, actually I don't think I have tests for, but you can just try it out. If you finish early, then do the 100 extra credit thing. Okay. Every exercise has this stuff at the bottom, the usage example. You reference it, you don't change it. Okay. So yeah, so this first exercise is actually just building the component. No patterns here, it's just like building a component that manages state. This is just to get your fingers warmed up. It's not. If this is hard or like really challenging for you, then the whole day will probably be really challenging for you. And yeah, because well, I want to be honest, because I have had people try to take this workshop who were not experienced with React, and they had a really terrible time of it. So so yeah, this is kind of a chance for you to see if you'll have a good time, I guess. Okay, so if you want to see the solution, you can go to exercise final and compare what you're doing with that solution. And then I recommend that you do two things while you're working through this through these exercises. The first is if you open up your terminal in the project directory and run npm run start or npm start, then that will start up the app, which should pop up in your browser. And here you can look at all the different exercises. So if we go to build toggle, then you'll see the exercise on one side and the final version on the other. And so you can see what it actually looks like the thing that you're building, what that actually looks like. And then the exercise box is where your exercise code will be rendered. You can look at only the exercise, just clicking the exercise, and there's even a totally isolated page for these as well. So you click on isolated, and that's like all that you're going to see is your component. So if you want to look at it that way. On some of these, if we go to number 6, then you're going to get this giant explosion of stuff. And this is actually really awesome. Thank you, Create React App, for making this. You can click on the X here if you want to play around with the final version. And yeah, but that error page is actually super cool. Watch this. So here's where we're having the error. So I'm going to click on that, and it's going to pop that open in my editor. What? Yeah, that's pretty cool. So it takes my editor right to where that is, where that error happened, which I think is pretty rad. So on Code Sandbox, I don't think that works. Like, you can't press the X on Code Sandbox for some reason. Somebody report that and fix it. That'd be cool. It's open source. I think that's, oh yeah, and then on, so you should be running the app. I think that would be helpful. And then also in another terminal window, you can run npm t or test or npm run test. They're all the same. And that will start up the tests in watch mode. And if you're not familiar with Jest, I've got actually another workshop about that. We can maybe I can show you some resources for learning how to use Jest. Yeah, so once you start Jest in watch mode, then you can open up the test that's associated with the exercise you're working on. And right now all the tests are testing the final version. What you'll do is just comment out the final and comment in the exercise. You save that, and Jest will run that that file for you. I try to give you useful, helpful error messages to guide you in the right direction. Okay? Yes, question? Put the, sorry, what? Oh, yeah. So let's see. Maybe I should put this in Slack or something. I don't have Slack open.
Is there a Slack room or something? supposed to be in for this?
No, there's not, but there is going to be a chat.
If you have a pen, I could probably write the thing, just because if anyone comes late, then
Yeah.
try writing it on here.
Thank you.
I know it's a bit. I saw a bad handwriting.
Did anybody else have any questions about the logistics and boring stuff of how this is all going to go down? How to use the project? Who has the project running, like the app open and running? Okay, cool. And tests running? Tests are good? Some of you? Okay, good. Okay. Advanced React Patterns V2. Okay, cool. So let me intro you to this first exercise, and then I'll set you free on that. So, this first exercise, like I said, is actually pretty basic. It's just a normal React component. So here, if you go into the app, click on Build Toggle, you'll see the final version is just this cool toggle button. We have a component called switch that accepts an on prop and an on click prop that you'll pass, and that's what renders this switch. So you're responsible for maintaining that on state, and then when it's clicked, you'll toggle it from on is true to on is false. And yeah, that's what you're building. You'll need to call the on toggle callback here, which is just this arrow function that console logs on toggle. After you've called this .set state, so after the state's been updated, you'll call this .props on toggle with this .state .on. Okay. Any questions? Okay, I'll set you free on that we'll probably go for like 7 minutes or so, and yeah, I'll walk around and stuff so you can ask me questions.
We're supposed to skip some of the tests.
Oh yeah. Thank you for asking that. I'll back and mention that for the live streamers too. So one other thing, somebody just asked about this test that we're skipping. When you're all finished and after I've gone through the solution as well, we're gonna take like 2 minutes or less, like 60 seconds, to fill out the elaboration and feedback after I've finished teaching you everything about this. So yeah, so don't worry about that one test until we get to the end. Sorry.
12 pass.
Oh, yeah. What's probably happening is you're running all of the tests, and maybe I should show how to do this as well. So just watch mode is amazing. If you read the watch usage here thing at the bottom, you can press W to show the watch usage. It's like an immersive experience in the terminal, so it's pretty cool. So then you can press A to run all the tests, and that's probably what's happening for you. It's running all of them. Yeah, it's got all kinds of really cool things. What you probably are going to want to do, and what I'm probably going to do, is press P to filter by file name. So I'll hit P and then 01. This is just a regex, so I could do like .star or whatever. But 01 will match just the first test. So thanks for asking. Yeah, and just skip that last one. Yep. Okay, everybody, or who's finished? Okay, I'll be I'll just help one other person. Yeah, so if you look at where you run and then you'll go back into your update and open up the tests. And then comment that out. And run the test with PM test. But you want to run or comment out as well. And if you in another team, PM test. Oh. It's a lot. That'd be a whole workshop by itself. Okay. Alrighty, so let's go ahead and work through this solution and answer any questions that you have about this. So I've got the test up and running. The first thing that we need to do is I'm going to import that switch, and then I'll render the switch instead of null. Switch on is going to be, we'll start it, just hard code it to false, and on click, we'll hard code that to an empty arrow function. And now our error is different, so we are it's not actually possible to toggle. And if we look at our exercise here, we're rendering the toggle, but we're not updating any state when it's clicked. So let's go ahead and update that state. So we'll say for the state, so I'm going to say state equals this object that has on property, and we'll initialize it to false. So then we can say this dot state dot on, and then if I switch on to true, just to see, make sure that works here. Okay, cool. And then we need to have some mechanism for toggling. So I'm going to say this dot toggle, and I'll create a toggle function that will be responsible for calling this dot set state. And we need to get the current state of the toggle and inverse that state or reverse it or whatever. So actually, not all, this is still a concept that is being taught to developers, so some of you may not be familiar with this. But lots of people will do something like this. You'll say on is this dot state dot on, and you'll negate that. Whoops. And with that, it actually works. So if we, at least it functions, so you can toggle it. That's great. The problem with doing this is when you reference the state of the toggle, or like when you reference state inside of a set state, you could potentially have problems with batching. So for example, if I do this, so that's going to toggle it off, or let's change this to false. So this will toggle it on, off, on, again. And if we, one more. Yeah, see, it's actually every single time I do this .state.on, it's always going to be the same. So set state is not synchronous. Set state is batched. And so when I say toggle the state, the on state, and then I say toggle it on, toggle the on state again, like this .state.on will always be false for all 4 of these set state calls. So anyway, if you weren't familiar with that, now you are. And anytime you need to use state when updating state, you have to use an updater function to get the current state. So that's what we're going to do. And then you'll return on is not the current state dot on. Okay? Cool. And so that should work. So that's our updater function at work. And then set state actually accepts a callback, and we want to call the on toggle prop as part of our after our state has been updated. So let's do that. This dot props dot on toggle with this dot state dot on. And now it's safe to use this dot state because it's going to be the current state after the batch is finished, or after the set state call is what it's called. And that should get your test passing. And if you pop this, open your DevTools, you should see on toggle showing up in the console. Yep. No, that's a good question. So yeah, it doesn't accept an argument, which I think is kind of odd. But I mean, you can get it from this anyway. So. Like the implementation of switch. So I have this big comment here that says stop, because you shouldn't have to change any of this code. But if you're curious, this is yes. So this is implementation detail stuff. It shouldn't matter to you. But if you're curious, the reason that this is written the way that it is because we have an input so that like HTML doesn't hate us. So we have like a checkbox, and we want to set the state of that checkbox. But we don't care about when that checkbox actually changes. And if we don't have an onChange prop on an input that is a controlled input, then it's going to warn us in the console and say, hey, this is read-only, and you don't have any mechanism for updating that. Well, we do. It's through this button. So yeah. So don't worry about the switch. Yeah. Cool. Any other questions? All right. Yeah, here, let me get rid of all this nonsense here really quick. That is the whole implementation.
So what if we take out the variable from the state and change the variable and do the set state?
You mean like if we just remove it entirely? Or we just set state. Oh, okay. Oh, right. That was what I was explaining before. So this dot state dot on, you mean?
No. If you take out the on in the variable.
Oh. Yeah. Yep. That works, and that's actually like my solution. So it's just syntax. Any other questions? Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah. So like this is what I would do if I were to rewrite this as using a constructor. So this is the default constructor in JavaScript. So if you don't provide a constructor, this is what is provided for you. That's why I'm getting this underline. It's useless because that's what the default is anyway. But we can move this up to here, and that's functionally equivalent to what we just had. We could also move this whole thing up here, and that's functionally equivalent to what we had as well. Yeah, so what, yeah. Yeah, so we can talk more about that a little bit later because I want to get us on the next exercise, and then I can help you during that that break. Okay, cool. So let's go to elaboration and feedback. It's really important for you to elaborate on what you learned. So I'm going to give you like 30 seconds, 60 seconds to go through this. So you just copy this URL, and when you ran the setup, it should have actually asked you for your email address, and that would pre-fill this, so you don't have to enter your email every time you do the form. But anyway, whether you did that or not doesn't really make a difference. It'll pop open this workshop exercise feedback form, and you can elaborate on what you learned. So I'll give you a little bit of time to do that. Okay, cool. So what did you learn? I'm going to just sit here awkwardly in silence until one person says something they learned.
Yes, I mean, you guys did forget it, set state batching.
Mm-hmm.
To remind you to come to call
Yep. That is really important, actually. And if you want to, so basically the rule is if you need to reference state in your state update, then you'll use a state updater function. If you don't like confusing rules, then always use a state updater function. Cool. Anything else? Anybody want to mention? All right. Let's move on to step 2, where we'll actually start doing patterns. So here we have, I still don't know how to use Visual Studio Code very well, but here we have that same toggle. It's implemented in the way that I implemented it, at least. It should be similar to what you did. And then if we go down here and look at the usage example, we're going to see some kind of tricky things. This is compound components. So we're going to render that toggle with the on toggle like we had before. But what if we wanted, as a consumer of this API, I wanted to have a message show up when the state was a certain state. So if it's on, then I want to render this, the button is on. And if it's off, I want to render the button is off. And I want to be able to control whether it's above or below the switch. So I have the button here, or maybe I want to have it like halfway through, or I want to have total control over the order of how these things are rendered, and even what is rendered based off of the state. So this is compound components, and your job is to implement that. Cody the Koala Bear is here to help, and even Marty is here to give you spoilers. And this one will be a little bit tricky if you've never used reactchildren.map. And so I provide a link to the docs for you to learn a little bit about that. And React clone element as well. So I'm going to give you 10 minutes for this one, and then we'll come back together to work on that. So let's get ourselves set up and ready to run this one. In the app, you'll go to It's actually like the URL should be pretty straightforward. Your localhost 3000.02. And then you should see on the finished version, it should be able to toggle back and forth on and off. And the exercise is just the regular switch. And then for the tests, you run npm test and the p key to filter by a file name 02, and that'll run the test called 02. And then you'll open that file in the test directory and swap out the final version for the exercise so that your tests start failing. Okay? Have fun! I like your ringtone. It takes me back a little bit. Anybody finish?
Okay, me.
Okay. Don't be afraid to ask for help if you need help. I'm starting to get a little bored. Okay, I think we're going to move on since there's lots to cover. And yeah, how many people finished? Okay, so if you didn't finish, you're in good company. But I do want to move on so we can get to the to as many of the patterns as we can today. Just to review the usage here really quick, and by the way, I forgot to mention this usage title thing is nothing special. Like it's literally all it's for is so I can render that right here. So don't worry about that. So yeah, the usage wants to have a toggle, and then these compound components. So these components that are actually on the toggle class itself as static properties. And I'll give you an example of how to do that up here. Where we can make a toggle candy prop. Candy! And so we basically need to do the same thing for these static, or for these other components. So we have a static on, and that's going to accept some props. And it's one of those props, like somehow it needs to know what the on state is. So we're going to say props.on. If it's on, then we'll render the props.children. Otherwise, it'll just be null. Okay? We'll do the same thing in reverse for off. So it'll be null or props.children. And then we'll have a static button that'll accept some props. And this one will be a little bit more interesting. It's going to render this switch. So on is going to come from props, and this will actually, we'll just render the rest of the, well, yeah, sorry. This will be props.toggle. Okay, so if you look at the usage, you'd think, hey, now hold on a second, I'm not passing any props, and I'm not allowed to change this. So what gives? We have to do some fancy stuff in our render method to take the components that the user is trying to render and provide props to those components. So we make copies of the element. So if you're familiar with how React works and what's actually happening when you're using JSX, JSX is an abstraction on top of React.createElement. So that's create element, it's not render element. It's like document.create element, create a div, but it doesn't actually put it on the document or anything. You're just creating this element. That's the same thing with React, and with React you take this element that you created, you can make a copy of it and provide additional props to that element. And so that's what we're going to do. And then we're going to use React Children Map so that we can take all of the children and make copies of every single one of them. Okay, so let's do that with return react.children.map this.props.children, and then for each child element we'll do react.clone element that child element with these additional props. So on is this.state.on and toggle is this.toggle. Oops, and all messed up. There we go. Okay, and let me get rid of all this stuff so you can see the full solution all together now. So that is the solution. Works great. This is compound components. What questions do you have about this? Or what made this exercise difficult or easy? Or when do you use this pattern? When is it useful? So this would be useful for any time you have, taking a quick step back, you know the select element in HTML has, here I'll just show by way of demonstration. So you have a select, and a select will have options, right? So, oops. Yeah. So by themselves, these elements don't do anything. Like a select by itself with no options is kind of useless, and an option by itself with no selects is also useless. So this is actually compound components in HTML. A compound component is, the compound components pattern is a collection of components that work together to accomplish a purpose. And in the way that they work together is through sharing implicit state. So the select shares some implicit state for the options to tell them which one of them is selected, and the option shares with the select what that option's value is. Okay, and so in the same way, we're making this or emulating the same kind of behavior by saying this toggle is going to manage the on state, and toggle on and toggle off are going to reference that to know whether they should render their children. And then the toggle button will let the toggle component know when it should be updating this state. It also references what the state currently is. So so anytime you have a situation where it would be helpful to share state implicitly between components, or maybe say that better. Anytime the internal workings of a component is irrelevant to consumers of that component, then compound components could be a good solution. It's a mechanism by which you can implicitly share and update state between components. So some examples of that, like accordion UI, you'd have some implicit state on whether or not a particular accordion is open or closed. Tabs UI, so you'd have like a tab list, and you'd have the tab title, and so you give people, like, you don't have to have like, often the way that we implement those kinds of components is you'll have a single component called tabs, and you'll provide it an object that is like the like information about those tabs, and then the component itself will be in charge of rendering those things out. But when you do things like that, you have to add additional properties for, like, which tab should be rendered first, or should this tab be disabled, and lots of extra things. Like if I wanted to do anything extra on those tabs, I'd have to add more a rendering specific API to that, like, data object, my tabs object or array that I'm passing to this thing. So by using compound components, lots of those API specific things just kind of melt away because I'm in control of rendering here as the consumer. Yeah.
So when it comes to, like, the static methods, they accept props, but we're not necessarily doing any, like, the props. Could we also access that same value just by using state in that scope?
Yeah, good question.
Or is there, like, something that would be wrong with doing that?
Yeah, so you're suggesting that maybe we could say this dot state dot on.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So the reason that won't work is because this is not referencing the toggle instance, because this is a static property.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So it doesn't have any sort of reference to any instance.
Right.
And if we wanted to do something like that, like, we could say off equals this thing, and so now this instance has an off property on it, but we wouldn't be able to access that here because we don't have access to the instance. We'd have to use a ref, and then, like, things would get really confusing. So yeah, good questions. One other thing, and maybe, like, in the future I should change the exercise. There's nothing sacred about these being static properties. So you can just make them regular variables, and that works just as well. I make them static properties because when I look at this, I'm like, on, okay, so is that one of my components or is that a toggle component? Like, I don't know. And so by making them static properties, it makes the relationship more clear. But I found in teaching this a lot that people get really tripped up by the static property thing, so maybe I should switch that and just show it later. Whoops, and then yeah, I think so. I don't think it's uncommon, but yeah, a lot of people seem to. I've tripped up a lot of people with that, so thinking maybe it'd be a good idea to not do it anymore.
When you say static, it's going to be used outside of the toggle itself. So you just say toggle on somewhere else.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, so I could use here. We could just rename this to a div here really quick, and it's going to blow up because now we're not passing those props. But yeah, there's nothing stopping me from using this outside. And our next exercise actually will make our toggle component and its compound components more flexible, and we'll address the rendering this outside of a toggle component. Because these particular components wouldn't make a whole lot of sense outside of the context of a toggle component. And so we can actually validate that people don't do that, and we can give them a useful error message. That's actually extra credit, but I'll show you how to do that. Okay, any other questions about this before we do the elaboration and feedback? So if you want to see the finished product, you can also go to exercises final, and that'll show you what things look like. Okay, cool. So go to your test, copy and paste the feedback thing, and then you can unskip this test and change submitted to true. Da, 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 da. So I'll give you a couple, 60 seconds to do that real quick, while I look at the questions on the chat here. All right, so what did you learn?
I'm still working on it.
Okay.
I've actually never used that pattern, so I've seen it, but never
Implemented it.
have to implement it. That's a lot of use case for most of
Mm-hmm. Cool. Good. Yeah, so you learned the pattern. Okay. Yep, that's good.
And me too, I can never use that.
Cool. Well, we're about to make it even better for certain use cases. So let's take a look at that. Yes, question.
In the button, we are destructuring what object? On and off is passing on and children. How do we know what we are destructuring?
Yeah, so how do we know what props these things are going to accept? Because we're not rendering those with the props. That's coming from our clone element, so we're providing additional props to the children.
So
Yeah.
you, and since we want to pass these props, we are cloning it.
Uh-huh. Exactly. We're making a copy, and that's what we return.
Why is this one element?
So if we didn't clone these elements and provide those additional props, then the user of our component is not actually passing those props. It doesn't have access to on or toggle, because on and toggle is within the toggle instance. So we have to provide those. Ah, there you go.
You know you had the instructions. That's
Cool. One other thing that, I think there are a couple things that I failed to mention. I probably should. So some people ask me, why do we use React children.map when this.children props.children is an array? We could just use this.props.children.map. And the reason is that this.props.children could actually be a single React element. If you're only rendering one thing, then now it's just a single React element. More than that, I looked at the code for React children map because I thought it was just as simple as, oh, if it's an array, then use map. If not, then turn it into an array and then use map. It's not. It's like super complicated, and I don't understand why. So you can go look into that. But React Children map is probably good. In Downshift, Downshift actually supports Preact as well, which doesn't have this method. So what I do is something like UI equals array.is array this.props.children. So if it is an array, then we'll just do this.props.children. And actually, I only want the first item in the array. So that's what I do to support both. But anyway, yeah, you could do some fancy stuff to make that work. There was one other thing that I can't recall. Maybe I'll think of it later. But let's go ahead and move on to handle our next use case. I think I busted something. My tests are broken. Oh, button. There we go. Okay. So if you look at exercise 3 and look at the usage below here, you're going to see, oh, I just remembered what my thing was. So really quick, so if I add a span here, then we're going to get an error both in the browser and in our terminal during our test, and it says received false for a non-Boolean attribute on. So what's happening is the children is every element that's rendered directly as a child of the toggle. And that includes the span, and we're cloning the span and providing on and toggle. So that would be like saying span on is true or false, whatever. That's not a valid attribute for a span element, and so that's why we're getting the warning. And so there are a couple ways you could solve this, but they all involve adding some logic here that says if this element is one of my static properties, then I clone it. Otherwise, I just return it. Okay. Or you could just throw an error and say, hey, you're not supposed to render anything except my compound components inside of here. So there's some things you could do to avoid that problem. Maybe I should add that as extra credit, actually. That's a good idea. Somebody file an issue. Okay, cool. So 0.3, we are actually experiencing this problem with 0.3, where now we're trying to render the toggle button inside of a div. Okay, and so what's happening is the div is what's getting the props, not the toggle button. And so we need to have some mechanism to provide the necessary information to toggle on, toggle off, and toggle button that doesn't depend on on cloning the elements through children. So somehow toggle needs to expose on and toggle in a way that toggle on, toggle off, and toggle button can access those anywhere in the tree. How many people have used the new context API in React? Okay, so you're going to get your first exposure to it here. It's going to be great. How many people use the old context API in React? Daring fellows. Yeah, it was not technically official. It was like, don't use this. The what? The router does. The router does. So yeah, if you used, yeah, everybody uses context, but not many people use it directly. And you're about to use the new API directly, and it's totally cool. And I've got a little explanation of how to use the context API in the comments above. And then Cody the Koala Bear will tell you what to do to implement that here. And then we've got a couple extra credit things that I'll probably work through for you, but you don't have to work through yourself. So your render method is totally going to change. It's going to look entirely different to support this improved API. I should mention also that sometimes this is actually an error. Like in some, I can see some use cases where you don't want people to be able to render things like divs in the middle, like for your tab list. Like why would you want a div there? I don't know. And so you could actually validate and still use React's clone element on the children. And if it's not one of your compound components, then you just throw an error and say, hey, that's not how you use this component. So it's totally valid to continue to just use clone element with the children. But if you want to give them total rendering flexibility, then you have to use this context thing. Okay, I'll set you off on that. Let's get things started. So you can go in your browser, go to Flexible Compound Components, that's 03, and you'll see the toggle button functionality doesn't work, so your job is to make it work. And in the tests, we swap the import of the final for the import of the exercise, and then we'll, in our watch usage, I'll hit P03, and that'll start running the 03 tests. With this one, I think we should take like an additional 10-minute break. So I think we'll do like maybe 10 minutes for the exercise, 10 minutes for the break. We'll come back in 20 minutes at 11 o'clock. Sound good? So feel free to get up, stretch, and move around, whatever. And then we'll come back and work through more stuff. Okay, so just a note on the comments here, where I explain how to use context. Here I'm saying theme context provider, and the value is this.state. You can do that, and you can make that work, and that's actually the finished version with the extra credit and everything will do that. But just to get things in a working state, you can actually provide an object here where you do on is the on state, and toggle is your toggle function. So you just basically copy the thing that you're passing to the clone element and paste it in the value. And that'll become the context value. Yep, that'll be what the consumers get out of context.
So what the children of the provider, is it give you any value?
Sorry, what?
I'm saying the team contact provider has to be on top of the consumer.
Yes.
The consumer have to be inside.
Yep, that's right. So what is happening is
I guess I could take a snapshot. I mean, I'm not trying to be cellular in my ways, but like I don't even know why I did it.
Yeah. So what's happening here is you're in control of rendering. You want to let whoever's using this be in control of rendering. So if I wanted to,
it totally works by accident.
yeah.
Okay.
Basically. So
What is this even doing if I have?
so
Basically, what this is doing
None
is
of this is having any.
yeah, exactly. It's ignoring
That's really not fair. Oh, that's so funny. I think I gotta go to that thing with Justin.
Yeah,
This
okay.
is great. This is really it's perfect.
So if you, I'm just trying to read the box, try to get an understanding. If you create context with no value, then it wouldn't, so then what would function that's being called for this
That
be empty? But then, okay. That's what I thought. So you're just able to pass props then from like to the children? I guess there's like a disconnect here somewhere still.
Yeah, sure. So the
Like if you weren't,
if you didn't provide, yeah, if you didn't provide a, oh, you mean like if you didn't use context
like,
or if you didn't provide a default.
yeah, if you didn't provide a default, would there be any use in using context?
Yeah, because the provider will, like the default is pretty irrelevant in most situations. It's what the provider's value is set to. That's what the consumer
Oh,
should
so
get.
here.
Yeah.
So, okay. And then that would be passed down props.
Not props. This is actually a render prop API.
Oh, okay.
That function will be called, and what you return is what will be rendered.
Okay, gotcha. Okay.
So the struggling and frustration, well, hopefully it's not frustrating, but the struggling is intentional. When you struggle with it first, then you understand my explanation better.
One question. Do we have to create, so I saw some example. Do we have to create a function like this and then this is the value
So you will need to call rank context. You don't need to call default value. So that's what
What?
you don't need that.
Well, you know Justin's house are being today, but future of our situation. This is my favorite. I love this workshop. So I've never been to one of Ken's workshops. I've worked with like 2.
It is a great job.
It's really hard. That's why I like it.
Yeah, Jaron, you missed it. I just said the struggle is intentional. It's not supposed to be easy. It's supposed to get you in a mindset to be ready to hear the solution. So if you haven't gotten up and stretched a little bit, I recommend that you do that. Even if you haven't finished, you've got 5 minutes left. So
I have to go, but thank you so much for the quick talk.
Yeah.
That's pretty fun.
yeah, great. Thank you. Good luck. Yeah. Yeah, I wasn't sure what the time was.
Yeah, it's all ready.
No, he's too enthusiastic. Just kidding. I'll make sure to talk nice and loud. Maybe I should move my desk over closer to his room. Anybody finish? If you did, you're pretty fast, so don't feel bad if you're not finished. Like I said, the idea isn't for you to get through all the exercises necessarily, but for you to play around enough with it so that when we go through the solution, you'll understand what we're talking about, have a little more context. The solution will make more sense to you. So the error that we're getting here is it's saying that the switch component is not being passed the right props, and that is because our switch component is inside of a div. And so when we do our clone element thing, we're cloning all of the children, and the children are toggle on, toggle off, and the div. It does not include toggle buttons. So that's what we're trying to solve. We want to give structural flexibility to consumers of the toggle component. We're going to use context to do that. So we're going to say toggle context equals react.create context. I'm not going to provide a default value. We'll look at that a little bit later. And then I'm going to swap out this React children map nonsense with a return of toggle context.provider. And the provider is actually just going to, as it's actually here, we'll slightly modify this. We'll forward along all this .props to that provider so that it forwards on the children so that it can render all of the children. But then we're also going to provide a value prop. And the value is going to be the same thing that we provided to our compound components. Get rid of all this nonsense. And that is our render method done for now. So then code of the Quala is still up here saying, hey, these compound components are going to need a consumer so that they can access the on and toggle. So let's go ahead and do that. For both, well, yeah, we'll just do toggle context dot consumer. And the toggle context consumer API, if we look up here in the comments, this for children actually needs to be a function that accepts the context value and then returns the thing that we want to render. So that's what we're going to do here. Let me just close that off. We'll create a function that returns the thing we want to render. In our case, that's on or children. So I'm going to call this context value. And then we'll say context value dot on, and then children is what we're getting from props. Okay, so we're no longer getting on from props, we're getting children from props. The props are being passed to us from the user. Toggle on, passing the children, but it's not passing the on state. That's coming from our toggle context provider, and so we're getting that out of context with the toggle context consumer. You get the context value, use the on state for that. And that's what we return. If it's on, then we return the children that we're getting from props, otherwise we return null. The children are right here. Yeah, so, yep, exactly. So we even with the old version, we were providing some props. We were providing the children prop, but then we cloned it to provide additional props. Now we're not cloning it anymore. We're just taking the props as they are, and then we are rendering the toggle context consumer so that we can get the context that we need, the on state. Okay, so we'll do something very similar with our off. So I'm just going to copy paste this off, and then we'll change this to null and children. And then for the button, we do something similar as well. I'll just cut this out. We'll have toggle context dot consumer, and that's going to take our context value and return the thing that we want to render. So we'll get on and toggle here. Then we can actually remove this and just do props. Okay? That makes sense? So the provider's responsible for injecting some state and anything. It can be a string, an object, an array, anything. So put that into context. Then the consumers are responsible for grabbing that out of context. And then you can render stuff based off of that. Yep. Yeah, if it needs to be multiple things, you just give it an object. Yep. Okay, so a couple additional considerations that were the extra credit. So we can provide, or here, let's just demonstrate the problem that a default value is supposed to solve. So if I turn this to a div like we were talking about earlier, it's no longer rendering the toggle context provider because now I'm rendering a div. And so we're going to get a bunch of errors, and that's because the context value is now undefined. It's not been defined because we're not rendering a provider. So the consumer is reaching into context and saying, "Oh, where to go? I can't find it." So it gets back undefined. So we are saying on, we're accessing on and undefined. That's the errors that we're getting. So there are two ways we can solve this. One is we could provide a default value in the scenario where the consumer is not being rendered in a provider. So I'll have on is false and toggle is an empty arrow function. That breaks our test because now it actually doesn't work with what we're expecting. And if you open up the app, you'll see that it's not working because our toggle doesn't do anything. We're not actually changing any state or anything. But it prevents the error. So there's that for you. If there are definitely situations where having a default for your context does make sense. This is not really one of them. Compound components, an option doesn't make sense outside of the context of a select. So it's better to not have a default for compound components. But the error that we're getting isn't all that helpful, and so what we can do is we can provide a more helpful error message. This is one of the things I love about React is how composable things are. So one thing that we could do is just say the context value here, we'll say, whoops, return that. We'll say if there's not a context value, then we'll throw a new error, compound or toggle compound components must be rendered in a toggle. Okay, so now we get a more helpful error message somewhere around here. Yep, right there. Okay, so that's more useful, but I don't want to have to do that everywhere. So what I'm going to do is I'll create a function called toggle consumer, and this is going to take some props, and then we'll actually just do basically this. We'll actually, sorry, no, basically this whole thing. Return. Okay, and then instead of what we're returning here, we'll actually return props.children and invoke that with the context value. Okay, and then rather than toggle context.consumer, we'll just use toggle consumer. And then we can restore this to its previous simplicity. Okay, and then we'll do the same thing for these, toggle consumer. And now for all of these, we're going to get that more useful error message that says must be rendered within a toggle. Right? So that's neat. So now we can update this because now we know what the problem is. We can say toggle and toggle. Okay, so validating, especially with compound components, I recommend validating those. I think that's useful. So here's one that is a little harder to demonstrate the problem. So I'll just explain it, what's going on. So the way that the toggle context provider works is it will automatically re-render all consumers whenever the value changes, right? That makes sense. It's what we want. If the value changes, then what is returned from our consumers will probably also change. Like when the context value to onProp changes, then we're going to change what we're rendering. The problem is that this render function can be called for any number of reasons. It could be called because we called this.setState. It could also be called if you're using the toggle inside of something else that calls this.setState and it re-renders the toggle. So when the toggle component's render method runs, it doesn't mean that the state or the context value has changed. It just means that it's running for some reason or another. Okay, so what's happening though is we're reallocating in memory a new object every single time this is rendered. So value changes on every render, which means that whenever the toggle component is re-rendered, all of the consumers will be re-rendered, even if the value state actually didn't change. Okay, and so that leads us to a bunch of unnecessary re-renders. So to get around this, you need to provide a value to the value prop that only changes when the state changes. The only thing that only changes when the state changes is the state. So what if I could make it work like this? Now the value won't update until I change the state, right? Until I call setState. The problem with that is we need to have some mechanism for providing the toggle, and this is what we could do. Move state below the toggle. After the toggle's been defined, then we can put toggle on the state. If that doesn't feel weird to you, then that's great. It is kind of weird, but this works really well, and yeah, this is kind of like I talked with some smart people on Twitter for a while, and this is where we landed on how to do this. Ryan Forn said that's what I do, and it works really well. Now, if there's some state here like secret state. If there's some state here that you don't want to share with all the consumers, then you have to do a little bit of extra work. You'd have something on here like context value, and then only provide this.state.context value. You have to do a little bit of extra work anytime you update the context value. You have to make sure that you're updating everything. So most of the time, just putting everything on state and then that you want in the value, and then passing this.state will be sufficient. Yeah.
Might be a little bit of a naive question, but why with and I know this might solve the problem, but does like context, create React that create context use like pure component under the hood for like props? Because then wouldn't it only? I mean, still there's edge cases where like parent re-rendered would still re-render something, but would that kind of solve the props issue?
So I'm not sure whether the provider is a pure component or not, but what I do know is that the provider will re-render consumers whenever this value changes. So like the object itself could get changed. I don't think that it checks any of the values of objects. It's just, is this reference the same as it was before? Where like with a string value, then like you're totally cool because it's, strings are strings, but when it's an object, you want that object to be the same object every time until things change. Lots of times this won't really be a big deal. Like unnecessary re-renders are like whatever in React. React is really fast. But it doesn't take a whole lot of work to avoid them, and so this is what I do for my React context providers. Okay. Any questions about this? Okay, I think we have pizza. I was told. Oh, you can smell it. Oh, okay, yeah. So I'll tell you what. Let me introduce the next exercise for you, and then we'll do the pizza and you can work through the exercise. We'll do like an hour and a half for all of that or something.
One question.
Yeah, question.
The context API is new, and I think when we use the Redux,
Mm-hmm.
do we still need this?
So yeah, the question is, if we're using Redux, do we need context?
Yeah.
So Redux and context solve wildly different problems. They're for very different things. I'm not going to go too much into it, but I wrote a blog post because this is such a common question called application state management, where I talk about the problems that Redux is intended to solve. Context helps solve the prop drilling problem, and can solve various other things like what we're doing here with the compound components. Yeah, if you're using Redux to solve the prop drilling problem, then you're not using Redux properly. It solves other problems. It happens to solve the prop drilling problem. And so anyway, yeah, you can read that. I have a newsletter I send out every week. And that's where these blog posts come from. This last week's newsletter was about the prop drilling problem, what that even is, and how you can avoid it. So anyway, if you're using Redux, do you need context? Maybe. Yeah, like it just kind of depends. I don't like Redux a whole lot, so I don't really use it very much. Yeah, I can't really see. No, I just use component state, and yeah, if I really need to, then I'll use unstated, which is great. Yeah, there are much simpler alternatives to Redux. So yeah, I pretty much never use Redux. Anyway, that's a different subject. So let's jump into number 4, and then we'll break for lunch. So here we've actually taken things back to basics. We're no longer using context or anything. We're going back to our regular switch. But our users now want to be able to use this component a little differently. So we experienced this API with the consumer, where the children is actually a function that returns some JSX. So we need to implement that same API for the toggle. This gives complete flexibility over the structure of our stuff, and it allows for people to access the onState and the toggle function themselves. So that's kind of neat. Yeah, so that's what you're going to be building. And Cody the Koala Bear is here to help with this. It is actually, when you're all finished, you'll be like, wait, that must be wrong, because it's too easy. It won't, like, it may not click right away, but it should be too easy. Like when you're finished, you should be like, I must be doing something wrong because it's too easy. So yeah, go ahead and head off to lunch. I think that, should we just do an hour, or do you want an hour and a half for lunch? So who wants just an hour? More time to do exercises and stuff. Who wants an hour and a half? Got a couple. I don't even, we'll do an hour and 15 minutes then. So we'll come back at 12:30. And I think I'll stop the broadcast here too, and I'll come back at 12:30. So see you at 12:30. Well, that's Pacific time, so in an hour and 15 minutes.